In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, a soothsayer warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. For most Americans, however, the Ides of March pass without incident. It's the Ides of April, April 15th, tax day, that so many Americans dread. Mr. President, the last few days must have been a big bonanza for the headache medicine industry. Taxes are due tonight at midnight, and millions of Americans spent their weekend struggling to use tax software that crashed, flailing about to locate receipts, and wading through hundreds of pages of tax instructions. Instead of enjoying the outdoors or spending time with family and friends, too many Americans spent this past weekend hunched over their kitchen tables or in front of their computers, surrounded by a maze of receipts, canceled checks, forms, and other paperwork as they undertook the annual water torture ritual of preparing tax reforms. This is the tax instruction booklet for our personal taxes, our 1040 forms. It just goes on and on, Mr. President, well over 200 pages. The first 104 pages of instructions are the basic Form 1040, and the further 110 pages of instructions are for the most common schedules to the 1040, but there has got to be a better way. Someday, Mr. President, I hope the Democrats and Republicans can come to the floor of this body, ask unanimous consent that this goes into the trash, and instead we substitute a much simpler way for our people to do their taxes. The reality is the tax code is too complex, too costly, and simply takes too much time to comply with. It's a code that's hopelessly out of date, mind-numbingly complex, increasingly unfair, and extraordinarily inefficient. As a result, one of our most consequential economic policies, our tax law does far more to stifle economic growth than to encourage it. Our country needs a comprehensive overhaul of our system of raising revenue and a modern tax code that's simpler, fairer, and simply more efficient. In sum, what's needed is a pro-growth economic tax policy. And if history is any guide, Mr. President, particularly when former President Reagan and a big group of Democrats got together, it can bolster American families and increase revenue, Mr. President, without raising rates. Now, I've been something of a broken record on this issue for some time, but on a day like this, particularly given what our people went through over the past weekend, I think it's time to spend a few minutes and talk about how important it is to bring some common sense to American tax law. What is particularly striking, Mr. President, is I think the Congress understands what needs to be done. This is a question of political will now. There have been all kinds of blue ribbon reports, the Bush administration, the Obama administration. I think what needs to be done is widely understood. The pipes in the tax code are clogged with provisions that encourage rent-seeking behavior, lead to the misallocation of capital, and warp the American economy. What needs to be done, Mr. President, is go in there and drain the swamp and clean out the tax code. It contains almost 4 million words. In the last decade alone, more than 130 laws have been enacted that yielded almost 4,500 changes to the tax code. That amounts to more than one change to the tax code each and every day, year in and year out. It's become so complicated that almost 90% of taxpayers either hire a tax preparer or use tax preparation software to complete returns. The IRS reports that the average estimated time burden for all taxpayers filing a Form 1040, a 1040A, a 1040EZ is 13 hours with an average cost of $210. With respect to these forms, non-business taxpayers face an average burden of about 8 hours, a full day's work, while business taxpayers face an average burden of about 23 hours, nearly 3 days of work. In 2011, the Small Business Administration found that among businesses with 20 or fewer employees, tax compliance cost $1,584 per employee. In addition to the escalating costs of compliance with this code, costs both time and money. The complexity of the code, in my view, has obscured the typical person's ability to understand it, and in my view, has undercut voluntary compliance, which is, of course, the bedrock principle of our tax law. With the ongoing debate about how to reduce the budget deficit, the tax code's complexity serves also to perpetuate what is known as the tax gap. That's the difference between what taxpayers pay and what is owed under the law. The most recent Internal Revenue Service estimate for the tax gap is $385 billion. Based on statistical trends, the likely gap for this year is going to exceed $420 billion. This is an underpayment of approximately 14%. Now, my gut tells me, and I serve on both the Finance Committee and the Joint Committee on Taxation, that some of this gap certainly is due to conscious tax evasion, but I also believe a significant portion of it is attributable to inadvertent mistakes in filing, many of which stem from the complexity of the code. Well-coordinated, thoughtful, comprehensive reform is going to reduce the need for many complex provisions that limit the ability of taxpayers to benefit from certain deductions, credit, exemptions, and exclusions. Comprehensive tax reform must eliminate the multiple provisions that require taxpayers to calculate their liability multiple times, such as the alternative minimum tax. Talk about bureaucratic water torture, Mr. President. All this weekend, across the country, we had middle-class folks essentially doing their taxes twice as a result of the minimum tax. And the personal exemption phase-out, PEP, and the phase-out of itemized deductions, Ps, isn't much easier. I just like to show this particular poster that demonstrates 11 tax forms. These are forms, Mr. President and colleagues, that the typical tax filer has to fill out every year, or if they can afford it, pay somebody to fill them out. Is this really necessary to run this full-time hand-cramping program? To have our citizens try to wade through all of this? We also have another alternative, Mr. President, a one-page 1040 form that I have worked on with colleagues for years. It is only about 29 lines long, Mr. President. Some industrious reporters took this particular tax form and they found that a typical citizen, and this was worked on by Democrats and Republicans, can fill out their taxes with this form in under an hour. Now, to illustrate how complicated the code has become, let me just refer briefly to capital gains. The income tax currently imposes at least 9 different effective tax rates on capital gains, depending on the taxpayer's regular rate, how long an asset was owned, the type of asset, and whether the taxpayer owes the alternative minimum tax. For this, the IRS provides 3 different worksheets, one with 37 lines to help taxpayers calculate their tax on capital gains. Comprehensive reform should make things easier for taxpayers by allowing a percentage exclusion for long-term gains and applying regular tax rates to the rest. That simple change, Mr. President, to just have an exclusion for a measure of capital gains that have been earned and then a progressive rate structure from that point on would sharply reduce the complexity of returns while maintaining fairness and opportunities for all our people to invest. Further complicating matters, a number of commonly used terms in the tax code, qualifying child, modified adjusted gross income, and more, have multiple definitions depending on the provision. Certainly, Democrats and Republicans should agree that uniform definitions for the most commonly used terms are something that shouldn't be a bipartisan issue. More than 40 definitions of small business exist in the tax code alone. Now, there's certainly policy reasons to provide tax benefits to families with children, but the definition of a child differs widely across the tax code. Children under 19 count in defining the earned income tax credit benefits. Those under 17 qualify for the child credit, and only those under 13 are eligible for the child and dependent care credit. Now, maybe these differences result from deliberate congressional actions about who ought to receive tax benefits, but I think they needlessly complicate tax filing and certainly lead to inadvertent errors that the Internal Revenue Service then tries to figure out how to correct. Other factors used to define qualifying children further complicate the situation, including the child's physical residence, custody arrangements, and who pays the child's living expenses. Establishing a single definition to determine whether taxpayers may claim tax benefits for children would simplify both tax filing and IRS processing of returns. And Mr. President, I see colleagues, are here, and I would only say the list goes on and on. The earned income tax credit, something vital to low-income, families. A whole host of different workshops. The educational credits, again, another example where families with students in college qualifying for multiple tax benefits to defray educational expenses often can claim only one of them. For example, a family may be able to claim either the Hope credit or the Lifetime Learning credit, but not both for the same student. If the family has more than one student, it may claim one credit for one student and the other for a second student. Determining which alternative is best requires multiple calculations and can conflict with the use of other tax benefits for education, such as Coverdale savings accounts and 529 savings plans. Comprehensive tax reform would, at the very minimum, coordinate these education benefits so that it would be easier for families to determine eligibility. Just how complicated have things become, Mr. President? A few years ago, Treasury's Inspector General for Tax Administration sent staff to pose as taxpayers at 12 commercial preparer chains and 16 small independent preparers. Of the 28 tax returns the professionals prepared, 17 had mistakes. All of the business returns were wrong. Let me repeat that. All of the business returns were wrong when professionals had prepared them. In 2006, the same sort of drill was undertaken. Again, the General Accounting Office found that professional preparers made mistakes. They mishandled those bread and butter kinds of issues like the earned income tax credit and the child care credit, and even got it wrong, Mr. President, whether the taxpayer should even itemize, at all his or her deductions. So the question, colleagues, is really, if the pros can't figure out how to file taxes isn't that clear, isn't that obvious to all of us that the tax code needs to be purged and these special interest breaks cleaned out so that rates can be held down for all, and that in fact we can agree on a simple tax philosophy. I can sum up mine in a sentence, Mr. President. I believe we need a tax system that gives everybody in America the opportunity to get ahead. If you're successful, we want you to be successful. You're going to pay your fair share, but nothing in the tax code is going to make it impossible for you to be successful in the days ahead. And if you don't have much, we're going to have a tax code that is simple and understandable, and when you work hard and play by the rules, you're going to have an opportunity to get ahead as well. Comprehensive tax reform is going to make it easier to file. It's going to lay out an opportunity for the Senate, Democrats and Republicans and independents to come together. And I close simply by saying, once again, Mr. President, we saw just in the past few days how broken and dysfunctional our tax system in America has become. Can you imagine what people thought when their software was crashing in the last couple of days? They're trying to find their receipts. They're flailing through filing cabinets, trying to find those documents that attest to their taxable events for the past year. And they can't know with certainty, based on some of those analyses by the General Accounting Office, whether they've done it right or even professionals have done it right. So until this Senate comes together on a bipartisan basis to work for a simpler, more coherent, tax system, one that promotes growth and eases the burden on American families and American business, until that is done, Mr. President, there will be no relief from the Ides of April. And that, in my view, is a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.